Hello, everyone. We'll start the presentation in about 1 minute. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Safety and Health webcast, Top 5 OSHA Safety Training Topics, presented by J.J. Keller. This is Alan Ferguson, Associate Editor at Safety and Health Magazine, and I'll moderate today's presentation. First, we'd like to thank you all for joining us, and on behalf of the National Safety Council, whose employees are currently working away from the office, we hope that you, your loved ones, and all the people in your lives are remaining safe and healthy wherever they are. We'll start the presentation in a couple minutes, but first there are some housekeeping items. As a disclaimer, the views of today's speakers and organization are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health Magazine. Any mention of a commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean the council or the magazine endorses those items. After today's presentation, we'll conduct a question and answer session with our speakers. To ask a question, click the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, type your question, and click the send button. Please feel free to ask your question at any time during the presentation. You don't have to wait for the Q&A to begin. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible, but we might not get to every question. The good news is that any unanswered questions will be forwarded to today's sponsor. After this presentation, you'll be asked to complete a brief evaluation survey, and I'll tell you more about that a little later. This webcast will be archived so you can access it after today's live event. To view this webcast and all of our past webcasts, please go to safetyandhealthmagazine.com/events. Or you may also receive a link in a post-event email. With that, let's introduce our speakers. With us today is Trisha Hodkovich. Trisha is an EHS editor who provides content for safety and environmental related publications on topics such as hazard communication, hazardous waste operations, bloodborne pathogens, spill prevention, Title III of the Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act, signs and labels, and written plans. Also joining us is Mark Stromey, a senior editor who focuses on OSHA construction and general industry regulations. Mark is an authorized OSHA outreach construction trainer and the lead editor on various J.J. Keller publications, including the OSHA Compliance for Construction Activities Manual and the Construction Regulatory Update newsletter. Additionally, Mark develops content for online safety training and authors numerous trade publication articles each year. Again, we'd like to thank you all for tuning in to this presentation. Trisha, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
All right. Thank you, Alan. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today's webcast is sponsored by J.J. Keller Training. J.J. Keller Training Solutions cover a broad range of topics and are available in a variety of formats: training on demand, DVD, streaming video, video books, all to help you meet your needs. And this is backed by regulatory experts, and using the latest techniques and technology, our training solutions give your employees the proper instruction they need. On behalf of our sponsor, thanks for joining us today. Safety training is critical to ensure employees know how to perform their jobs safely and without injury or illness. We're going to cover 5 training topics today: powered industrial trucks, hazard communication, lockout, tagout, bloodborne pathogens, and personal protective equipment. These are what we like to call bread and butter training topics. A lot of employers need to do training under these 5 topics. Hopefully, you'll walk away from this event knowing more about who should receive training, when training should or must be provided, and why providing that training is important. If you have regulatory or training questions during the hour, as Alan stated, feel free to post them in the Q&A box. We will also save time for Q&A sessions or questions and answers at the end. So Mark will start us out with the first topic, powered industrial trucks.
All right. Hey, thanks, Tricia, and thank you for joining us today. As she said, we're going to start with powered industrial trucks, or PITs. Now, this equipment includes forklifts, powered pallet jacks, stand-up rider lift trucks, order pickers, and the like. In fact, there's one major compliance issue. Some employers have failed to train operators on all the different types of PIT equipment that their employees operate. So even powered pallet jacks require training under the regulation, which is 1910-178, and that training needs to be equipment specific. Now, it's important to remember you don't necessarily have to train each operator on every pallet jack made by a different manufacturer. That's not the intent. But OSHA does prohibit allowing an operator, say, who only has forklift training, to even operate a powered pallet jack. Additional training has to be done. Now, OSHA requires that refresher training be conducted under certain circumstances. There's no set frequency, but there are some things that are bells that will require you to do some retraining. For example, when there's an accident or near miss, when the operator is observed operating unsafely, and when the operator is assigned to drive a different type of truck, also when a condition in the workplace changes in a way that could affect safe operation of the PIT, or finally, when an evaluation reveals deficiencies. And aside from the refresher training, OSHA does require evaluation every 3 years. So you have to evaluate your operator at least once every 3 years. So here's something that comes up all the time. What about temporary employees? Well, OSHA has a bulletin, that TWI Bulletin 7, which addresses this. It says that generally the staffing agency is responsible for generic PIT training, and then the host employer provides the necessary site-specific training. Now, that makes a lot of sense, right? Because only the host employer knows what kind of equipment's being used and controls the condition of the workplace. So certainly they would be the one that would do it. The training and evaluation should be the same, for temporary workers that the employer provides for their own employees. Sometimes if the staffing agency supplies trained PIT operators, the host employer has got to verify that training and provide them the site-specific information needed. So the host employer also has to conduct a workplace evaluation of each of those operators from the staffing agency. The extent of that training and evaluation is based on the operator's past experience. Maybe they have 10 years of experience on this type of forklift. In that case, you do not need to duplicate that training, and it does not need to be extensive as the initial training and evaluation. OSHA also goes on to say something else very interesting. If the staffing agency provides those trained PIT operators, it certainly has the training records and evaluation records. In these cases, if I'm the host employer, I'm pretty sure that I want to see those training records. So there has to be some way to get those so that I can take a look at them. And OSHA even goes on to say that the host employer has to know where the training and evaluation records are located. Why? Well, they may be asked for when there's an inspection. So the OSHA compliance officer says, hey, where's all the training records for your PITs? And therefore, the host employer is going to want to be able to access those immediately. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the training types. OSHA's requirements are performance-oriented to permit the employers to tailor a training program to their workplace and to the specific types of PITs that they operate there. So you can see on the slide all the different types of truck-related topics you have to cover. There's quite a few. And also in a 1999 letter of interpretation, OSHA answered a question on whether truck-related training has to be weight and brand specific. They went on to say that the training isn't based on weight or brand, but instead on whether the trucks an employee may operate differ with respect to any one or more of those truck-related topics that you can see there. Very important. Then OSHA talks about workplace-specific topics, and those are on the slide. Very important to train on these. That same letter of interpretation said whether an operator that we trained or that was trained and evaluated at one of the employer's facilities, and they go to another location, do they need different types of training? And OSHA said that it depends on whether these facilities differ with respect to one or more of these topics. So, for example, let's say this, where all of the employers' facilities have similar ramps and narrow aisles, no additional training on those topics would be required. However, additional training would be required if the loads to be carried differ. So you have to keep this in mind when you're moving from location to location. An employee one day works in this location, all of a sudden he has to go to another. These are the types of training things that we're going to run into that can cause some problems. All right, so there aren't a lot of regulations, or let me rephrase that. Some OSHA regulations have specific requirements for conducting training, and as we've said, 1910-178 is one of those. So what about the training? What do we have to do? And according to the regulations, training must consist of a combination of formal instruction. These could be things like lecture, discussion, interactive training, a video they watch, written material like handouts that you pass out. But then you also have to do practical training. This would be things like the trainer shows the operator how to inspect the forklift, whatever. It's hands-on practical demonstrations. And then finally, very important, the operator has to be evaluated. Their performance in the workplace has to be evaluated to determine if they're competent to operate that equipment. So what about, as we said, let's say you have an employee that you hire and that they've had 10 years of experience operating the type of forklift that you plan on having them operate. OSHA addresses this, and there's no need for additional training if that operator's received training on a specific topic. The training is appropriate to the truck and working conditions, and you have evaluated the operator and found them to be competent to operate that truck. So OSHA gives you a break. They don't expect you to do all that again when it's not necessary. Now, here is one that I know Tricia gets questions on. I have. What about the trainer? What about their qualifications? Well, OSHA says that they're very vague in this, and they did that intentionally. They only say the trainer must have the knowledge, training, and experience necessary to conduct the training. Again, this is performance-oriented. OSHA believes the necessary qualification for this can be obtained in several ways. One is through years of operating a powered industrial truck, the trainer has knowledge of safe practices and the pertinent OSHA regulations. Another way, going to a train the trainer forklift course. And also another one could be a combination of experience and training. So they leave it up to you. And again, a lot of people are a little confused by that. They think they have to go to a train the trainer course. not necessarily true. It's a good idea, but it's not required. The only specific criteria OSHA has is found in a 2003 letter of interpretation. And this does give some clarification. It says that the trainer must have at some point operated the type of equipment they're training potential operators on. And this is done so that they can provide adequate instruction. This includes knowing how the equipment works, how it handles. In other words, a worker may not simply watch a training video and then read the forklift regulation and then think that they're going to be able to conduct training. So it's very, very specific from that letter of interpretation, very good information. Now, the employer is required to designate someone to teach the safe operation of the powered industrial trucks, and then, of course, ensure that operators do have the proper skills and knowledge before signing off on the certification. So this is something that is done in writing. You're certifying that the employee has passed the test and the evaluation. So employers, it's important to be aware of this because you may have to state your case to OSHA as to why the person you've chosen is going to do the instruction. All right. Now, we mentioned the certification, the written certification. So that is the documentation that you need. You must certify that each PIT has been trained and evaluated as required by the regulations. And that certification has to include the name of the operator, date of the training and evaluation, and the identity of the person performing the training or evaluation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tricia.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Mark. Let's look at hazard communication. The hazard communication, or HazCom, information and training provision at 1910.1200H1 is the most frequently cited serious OSHA training violation for general industry. It's OSHA's most wanted for training. Now, this is interesting. Recently, a company was cited for failing to provide effective HazCom information and training for workers who were required to work with corrosive cleaning chemicals. Because one of the company's other locations was cited for a similar violation, the new violation was considered a repeat violation. So OSHA proposed a $60,000 fine. That's large. That's huge. This long-standing HazCom standard remains one of the most confusing OSHA regulations, affecting over 5 million workplaces, even before its changes based on the Globally Harmonized System, or GHS, in 2012. Paragraph H was cited over 3,000 times every year. And this is just federal OSHA. Your state plan states also give out citations for HazCom. Now, we will examine the who, what, when, why, and how of the HazCom training provision today. You must train all workers who may be exposed to hazardous chemicals under normal operating conditions or in foreseeable emergencies. Foreseeable emergency means any potential occurrence that could result in an uncontrolled release of a hazardous chemical. Now, for contractors, the standard requires that the host and the contractor exchange information so each can train their own workers. Staffing agencies and host employers are jointly responsible for training temp workers. Staffing agencies must, at a minimum, provide generic training. The host employer holds the primary responsibility for training in HazCom since it uses or produces chemicals, creates and controls the hazards, and is best suited to provide temp workers with site-specific training. And for that, you can refer to the Temporary Worker Initiative, or TWI, Bulletin Number 5, for information on temp workers regarding HazCom. Now, office workers, bank tellers, and others who encounter hazardous chemicals only in non-routine, isolated instances are not covered. OSHA has or does not specify who can present HazCom training, nor is any formal certification required to do so. You, the employer, are responsible for ensuring your workers are adequately trained. So you decide who's qualified to conduct training. OSHA does allow for contractor-provided training. Training for each worker needs to cover the details of the written HazCom program, also information about shipped container labels and any workplace labeling system you use. For example, if in-house labeling includes HMIS or NFPA rating systems, your workers must understand what these systems mean and how to utilize the information. If you still have hazardous chemicals labeled under the old HazCom standard, the one prior to 2012, you must provide training on the different labeling systems to ensure that workers understand that the lack of pictograms or hazard statements and so on does not mean that the hazards don't exist. Workers must understand that the labeling system for shipped containers has changed since the purchase of those items back prior to 2012. So ensure that workers are aware of where they can get all the information on the hazards of these chemicals. Another training element, safety data sheet or SDS requirements. This includes how to obtain and use the hazard information on an SDS, including the format. If you are maintaining material safety data sheets or MSDSs for products received prior to June 1st, 2015, you must cover the differences between MSDSs and SDSs and how to utilize the MSDS. Here are the remaining training elements. What operations have hazardous chemicals, including byproducts? The location and availability of the written program, chemical inventory, and SDSs. How you monitor for hazardous chemicals. Hazards of chemicals in the work area. And measures workers can take to protect themselves, like work practices, emergency procedures, and personal protective equipment. Training is required at the time a worker is assigned to work with any hazardous chemical and whenever a new hazard is introduced into the worker's work area. The requirement for an employer to provide updated training is based on the hazard, not the chemical. So if someone is working with a flammable solvent and another flammable solvent is introduced, the training does not need to be updated. However, in this case, if a corrosive is introduced, the training needs to be updated. You may choose to initially train based on the chemicals. So if you have only a small number of chemicals, you may wish to discuss particular hazards of each chemical. And if a new chemical has hazards that a worker has been trained on, no retraining occurs. But if the new chemical has a hazard the worker has not been trained about, retraining is limited to that hazard. Now, in multi-employer work sites, the employer is responsible for providing updated training when its workers are exposed to new hazards, even if these hazards are created by other employers. Refresher training is not required annually for HazCom, but providing training once and then assuming that years later workers are still knowledgeable is a risky assumption. It's wise to set up a system for periodic retraining. HazCom training is a good thing. It ensures information is provided, explains and reinforces the information presented through labels and SDSs, and it offers an opportunity for workers to ask questions. Training is required to be provided at no cost to workers, and workers must be paid for the time they spend at training. The training provisions are not satisfied solely by giving workers data sheets to read. Rather, your training program is to be, well, a forum for explaining not only the hazards of the chemicals in the work area, but also how to use the information generated in the program. This can be accomplished in all sorts of ways: audio visuals, classroom instruction, interactive video, and online training are all good examples. However, OSHA explains that workers must also have the opportunity to ask questions and receive timely responses. The training must be comprehensible. If you give job instructions in a language other than English, then the HazCom training and information will also need to be conducted in that language. If employees have low literacy, training must be provided so they can understand it, such as by oral instruction. Now, as I said, you can either cover categories of hazards or specific chemicals and their hazards. OSHA consistently holds that training must be effective, so OSHA inspectors, they will often ask your workers if they know the location of SDSs, if they can list the health effects of chemicals they work with, as well as what to do in an emergency. If your workers cannot respond properly to these questions, even if the workers had been through documented training, OSHA can still cite you. If you're interested in up-to-date, consistent HazCom training content, JJ Keller offers a wide variety of in-depth and micro-learning programs covering not only HazCom, but all workplace safety, transportation, and HR topics. Use the poll on the screen to select your interests. And since JJ Keller Training is the sponsor of today's webcast, when you ask for more information, you'll also receive a complimentary white paper, The Ins and Outs of HazCom Training. It's a good one. I don't want you to miss that white paper. Okay, Alan, I think you're up.
Yeah, so while we wait for everyone to fill out the poll, Mark, I had a question for you. So when we're training forklift operators on inspecting a forklift before use, do we have to instruct them to document it with a written inspection checklist?
All right, Alan, that is a really good question, and it may surprise you, but OSHA doesn't actually require the inspection to be documented in writing. Now, of course, with that said, many employers do require the forklift inspection checklist be used for that pre-shift inspection. That's because using a checklist, that's the best practice, and it serves to ensure that the operator, in fact, performs that inspection. Using a checklist, that's also a really good way to prove compliance with the OSHA requirement. Now, if an OSHA inspector happens to be at your facility, you can show him your recently completed checklist.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Alan, and thank you, Mark. Great question and answer there. So we are on to one last HazCom slide. You may be aware that OSHA issued a proposed HazCom rule in February. Changes are proposed throughout the regulation and mainly impact chemical manufacturers, importers, and distributors. However, employers will need to maintain, under this proposed rule, if it is finalized, employers would need to maintain any new safety data sheets and train employees about new hazard classifications related to, they have a few here, new ones, aerosols, desensitized explosives, and flammable gases. The hazards of these chemicals have really not changed. What's changed is their classification, and it's required under this proposal, again, this is a proposal, not a final rule, that employees understand these classifications before they may be exposed to these chemicals at work. Now, because this is a proposed rule, This is not effective at this point. You will want to wait until a final rule before you need to worry about all of this new training and the new SDSs and all of that. All right, now I'll turn things back to Mark.
All right, so let's talk about lockout, tagout. So an effective lockout, tagout program is only as good as the training. OSHA does require you to train employees based on their duties and or exposure. Now this depends on whether the employees are considered authorized, affected, or other. Authorized employees, of course, need the most training, and other employees the least. However, in all cases, employees must understand the purpose and function of your company's energy control program. Let's define these three. So authorized employees do the servicing, maintenance, and repair. They apply the locks or tags and follow the lockout, tagout procedures. Affected employees, they're the ones that operate or use the machine. And of course, when the machine's down for servicing or maintenance, the employee can't run it. So he or she is affected by the equipment being locked out. Remember, affected employees don't do any service or maintenance work and have to stay clear of the equipment during repairs. And then finally, we have other employees, and other employees are those that their work activities are or may be in an area where energy control procedures are being used. For instance, if they're walking through the machine shop on the way to the break room or whatever, they would see equipment locked out, and then of course they would be considered other employees. So now that we talked about these three, let's talk specifically about the levels of training that they need. Authorized employees, as I mentioned, need the most detailed training. They have to be trained to recognize hazardous energy sources, the type and magnitude of the energy available in the workplace that they'll be working, the machine that they'll be working on, and they must know how to isolate the equipment from its energy sources. Affected employees, they need to be trained to recognize a machine malfunction and how to report the problem to their supervisor, who in turn will report it to an authorized employee. And then other employees, as I mentioned, have to be instructed about lockout, tagout procedures, about the prohibition relating to attempts to start the equipment, which I find it hard to believe that they would, but again, OSHA requires that you do need to train them and not to try to unlock or take tags off or locks off equipment. And again, as we've talked about a couple times already, we're talking about temporary employees. And as always, OSHA expects temporary employees to receive the same training as permanent employees. And again, here's another bulletin, Bulletin 10. OSHA states that the host employer is responsible for ensuring that if a temp worker is performing activities covered by the lockout tagout standard, the worker is properly trained and understands your company's procedures and policy. Now, when tagout is used, authorized, affected, and other employees have to be trained in the limitations of the tags. Now, what are tags? Well, essentially, they're just a warning device. They don't really provide the physical restraint that a lock does. Tags, of course, are not to be removed without permission of the authorized person responsible for them. They should never be bypassed, ignored, or otherwise defeated. Also, tags can evoke a false sense of security. That's very important to know. Employees must also be instructed that tags be legible and understandable by all authorized, affected, and other employees. Tags must be made of materials which will withstand the environmental conditions encountered in the workplace. You don't want them falling off because they got wet or they somehow were affected by a chemical. They have to be securely attached to energy isolating devices, so they can't, if you brush against them, they can't just fall off on their own. All right, when should employees be trained? They need to be trained initially or prior to performing service or maintenance on equipment or a system. They have to be trained for employee proficiency. They have to understand what they're doing, and they have to be trained when there are new or revised procedures. There is no requirement for annual retraining. However, as Tricia mentioned, people trained 10 years ago may have forgotten a few different things, so it's always a good idea. All right, so again, what does OSHA say about training? If it isn't written down, it didn't happen. So of course the standard requires documentation. Specifically, the regulation says you must certify the employee training has been accomplished and is being kept up to date. The certification must contain the employee's name and date of training. And with that, I will turn this over to Tricia.
All right, thank you, Mark. So let's see, we're on to bloodborne pathogens, and that's our topic here. So the phrase bloodborne pathogens sounds like something out of a medical book, and it was until 1991 when OSHA published a regulation under the same name. 29 CFR 1910.1030 is meant to protect workers from exposure to hepatitis B, HIV, and other microorganisms that are transmitted through blood or certain other body fluids. And so the regulation covers over 700,000 employers, and not just those in the healthcare industry. I know that is kind of a myth. This regulation can apply to many in the manufacturing, service, government, and other industries. In fact, about 45% of bloodborne pathogen citations last fiscal year went to industries other than healthcare. Even though the regulation has been around for decades, it's still one of the most cited, with about 250 to 500 federal OSHA violations each year. It's another good reason to focus on this as one of our 5 employee safety training topics. According to the regulation, the employer, and I'm quoting, "The employer shall train each employee with occupational exposure," end quote. Now, OSHA jurisdiction extends only to employees. It does not extend to unpaid students, for example, who are not employees. Also, it makes no difference whether the employee is full-time, part-time, contract, or temporary. An employee is covered by the training requirements if he or she has occupational exposure. And by the way, for temp workers, you may want to refer to Temporary Worker Initiative, Bulletin number 6, for that information. Now, an exposure incident, that term is actual contact with blood or other potentially infectious material, or OPIM, whereas the term occupational exposure is reasonably anticipated contact with blood, or OPIM. In addition to being reasonably anticipated, the contact must result from the performance of an employee's duties. You likely would not reasonably anticipate an office worker to have contact with blood or OPIM, but if you designate the office worker to perform first aid involving blood-related injuries of coworkers, then that employee is covered or considered to have occupational exposure. 1910.1030 does not cover Good Samaritans. No employer can anticipate Good Samaritan acts, so no employer can anticipate these types of exposures. Anyone who voluntarily assists a person at work is not covered unless they are designated or expected de facto to assist workers. Unfortunately, OSHA does not tell you what jobs or tasks have occupational exposure, so you have to make a determination whether your workers, whether they're housekeepers, maintenance workers, security personnel, or anyone else, have occupational exposure by definition. The occupations listed on the slide may have occupational exposure, but not necessarily in all cases, and there may be other occupations that indeed have occupational exposure. You may be wondering if one of your staff members is qualified enough to provide training. Well, you need a trainer that's knowledgeable in the subjects covered by the training elements listed in the regulation. And this trainer must also be familiar with how the training elements relate to your workplace. You don't have to have a healthcare professional do the training, but an OSHA inspector will look at the specialized courses, degrees, or work experience of your trainer if the inspector finds any deficiencies in your training program. If there's no one qualified at your location, you may need to send workers out to get training or bring a trainer in, as long as that trainer meets the qualifications. So while the provisions for employee training are performance-oriented with flexibility to allow you to tailor your program to the employee's background and responsibilities, the training elements listed in paragraph G2 of the Bloodborne Pathogen Standard must be covered at a minimum. And some elements do call for site-specific information. The training elements do relate to the items listed on this slide. Information and training are required 3 points in time here at the time of initial assignment to tasks with occupational exposure, and this means prior to being placed in positions where occupational exposure may occur. Also train at least annually thereafter, and this means at least once every 12 months within a period not exceeding 365 days. Training should be provided on a date reasonably close to the anniversary date. If the annual refresher cannot be completed by the anniversary, you should maintain a record indicating why the training is delayed and when the training will be done. A third point in time to train is when changes affect an employee's occupational exposure. Changes include modification of tasks or procedures or the institution of new tasks or procedures. The additional training may be limited to addressing just the new exposures that are created. Ensure you provide bloodborne pathogen information and training at no cost to the employee during paid working hours. Other considerations in how to train. Comprehension. The regulation says your training content and vocabulary must be appropriate for your trainees' education level, literacy, and language. Format, audiovisuals, classroom instruction, interactive video, online and computer-based training. These are all good training tools that can be used as part of an effective training program. However, training the employee solely by means of a film or video without the opportunity for discussion would constitute a violation. And similarly, generic online or computer programs, even interactive ones, are not sufficient unless the employer supplements such training with the site-specific information required and the trainer is accessible for interaction. Now, during training, it is also critical that trainees have an opportunity to ask questions and receive answers where material is unfamiliar to them. Trainees must have direct access to a qualified trainer during training. However, the trainer does not need to be in the room. OSHA's requirement can be met if trainees have direct access to a trainer by way of a telephone hotline. Email is not considered direct access unless the trainer is available to answer emailed questions immediately at the time the questions arise. Sufficient hands-on training is also important because it allows a trainee to interact with equipment and tools in the presence of a qualified trainer and gives the trainer a chance to assess whether the trainees have mastered the proper techniques. Records of bloodborne pathogens training are not confidential. They're kept for at least 3 years from the training date, and training records may be stored on site where they will be accessible for review. Providing bloodborne pathogens training does not just make compliance sense, it makes common sense. An employee's health depends on receiving proper training on the job. And once your employees understand bloodborne pathogen hazards, taking those safety measures will be a routine part of their jobs. The key is to train them before they are called to take action involving anticipated contact with blood or OPIM. And that way they can make the right decisions to safeguard themselves and their coworkers. If you need help satisfying OSHA's bloodborne pathogens training requirements, J.J. Keller also offers training content in this area as well. Formats include DVD, video training book, streamlining video, and online training course formats. So again, if you'd like more information on J.J. Keller training, select your interests on the poll, and we can also send you a complimentary white paper on bloodborne pathogens. It's a good one. I hope you don't miss that one. All right.
Once again, while we wait, Trish, I'll ask you a question. If someone is injured and another employee has to clean up a blood spill, does that employee need full bloodborne pathogens training, or would awareness training be enough?
That's a great question. Yeah, a lot of folks ask about awareness training. Okay, in this case, if the worker's job includes cleaning and decontaminating of blood-contaminated areas, that is occupational exposure. So yes, your employees who are designated or expected to clean up blood after someone has an injury that involves blood would require that full training under paragraph G2 of the regulation. So take a look, 1910.1030 G2. However, here's a thought. Instead of training all your workers, you may want to designate a small number of workers for blood cleanup and give those workers the full training. And then instruct all your other workers to simply notify the designated workers when there is a blood cleanup spill. So yeah, definitely full training here, but there's some flexibility in how you approach it so you can lessen your burden and train a small number of employees for blood cleanup. Good question, Alan.
All right, I think I'm up next here. Our last topic before we get to some of your questions is personal protective equipment, PPE. So before we actually get into that, let's cover a little background. And I'm sure a lot of people have seen this pyramid, hierarchy of controls. It's been around for quite some time. Let's start with the basic idea of controlling a hazard at its source, which is the best way to protect employees. Now, depending on the hazards at your workplace, OSHA recommends the use of engineering controls to manage or eliminate hazards to the greatest extent possible. For example, building a barrier between the hazard and the employees, that's an engineering control. Changing the way in which employees perform their job is a work practice control. The best things, though, are elimination and substitution. They're very difficult to implement in an existing process. The best way to incorporate these is if the process is in the design stage, then you can do these things, and it's going to be less expensive and it's going to be simple to implement. But for an existing process, major changes in equipment and procedures, that's going to be pretty tough. So and more expensive. So engineering controls are favored over administrative and PPE controls for existing workplace or worker exposures. Why? Because they're designed to remove the hazard at the source before it comes in contact with the worker. Well-designed engineering controls can be very effective in protecting workers, and will be typically independent of worker interactions, which is even better. The initial cost of these controls typically are higher than just the cost of administrative controls or PPE, but it's important to realize that over the long term, operating costs are frequently lower and often can provide a cost savings in other areas of the process. Administrative controls, what are they? They require the employee or worker to do something. This can include training workers to understand the warning signs related to the hazard, or the employer reduces the time an employee is exposed to the hazard. These controls are relatively inexpensive to establish, but over time, they can be very costly to sustain. These methods for protecting workers have also proven to be less effective than other measures. And this is because it requires a lot of effort by these affected workers. So OSHA talks about personal protective equipment, and that is used when these other controls, engineering, work practice, administrative controls, they don't provide sufficient protection. So then you fall back to personal protective equipment. You have to provide it to your employees, and you have to make sure it's being used. And why? Why use PPE? Well, again, there's hazards that can't be controlled with the other measures, so we need to provide PPE. We all kind of know what some of the common types, we can visualize that: gloves, foot and eye protection, protective hearing devices, hard hats, respirators. But remember, PPE is that critical and last line of defense that workers have to protect themselves. What about training? Well, OSHA requires the employer to provide training to each employee who is required to use that PPE. What needs to be trained on? When that PPE is necessary, what PPE is necessary, how to properly put it on, take it off, adjust it, and wear it. Also, the limitations of the PPE. Very important to teach and train your employees on this, because PPE is not perfect. Also, how do you care for it? How do you maintain it? What about the useful life? And what do you do when you need to get rid of it? These requirements that I just mentioned are found at 1910-132F. Now that last one, the respiratory protection, that's got a whole bunch of very specific training and information that's required to be given to the employees. So that is outside of that 1910-132. That's at 1910-134K. So it's very detailed, and I suggest you go out there and take a look at that. So what about retraining? We've talked about retraining in pretty much all these other topics. So when the the employer has reason to believe that an affected employee who's already been trained no longer has the understanding and skill required, then the employer needs to retrain that employee. What are some circumstances where this would be done? So we've got a couple, 3 on the screen. There may be more, but these are the most common. Retrain when there's changes in the workplace that renders previous training obsolete. There's changes in the types of PPE to be used that makes that previous training obsolete. And then finally, inadequacies in the affected employee's knowledge or use of assigned PPE indicate that the employee has just not retrained that required understanding or skill. And with that, I will turn it over to Tricia.
Thank you, Mark. So you may have found that the COVID-19 pandemic has presented difficulties in complying with OSHA training standards, including the ones we talked about today. OSHA understands this and has provided enforcement discretion around the completion of training and has told its inspectors to evaluate whether an employer has made a good faith effort to comply. Inspectors will look at whether you explored other compliance options like remote communication or virtual training, whether you considered controlling the hazard in other ways, or whether you've rescheduled training. Now, where compliance was not possible given the ongoing pandemic, inspectors will ensure that workers are not exposed to hazards for tasks which they were not prepared or trained. If you were unable to comply because state orders forced your company to close, OSHA says you should demonstrate a good faith attempt to meet the requirements as soon as possible following the reopening of the workplace. And the first two memos go over what I just said kind of in a legalese format, so you may want to take a look there. Also, OSHA does intend to issue an emergency temporary standard very soon for COVID-19, and it is likely that the new rule will include some employee training component. Well, you imagine that. While the specific requirements are unknown to us, to everyone at this time, you may wish to refer to the non-mandatory guidance recently issued by the agency. It does talk about some topics for training, some suggestions there, and some related regulations with training there. So that's what the last bullet on this slide is about. Okay, Mark?
All right. Thanks, Tricia. All right, before we move into our Q&A session, I'd like to once again mention the sponsor of today's webcast, J.J. Keller Training. Whatever your company's needs, J.J. Keller Training can help with 24/7 access to hundreds of online courses and streaming video training across multiple industries. If you missed the opportunity or joined us late, we're offering a free white paper to be sent to you, and please request that when we get the poll up, there we go, use this on your screen, and we'll be happy to send that out by the end of the week. And now I think we're ready to take your questions. Alan, back to you.
All right, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and thank you both for this fantastic and insightful presentation. Before we start the Q&A, I want to remind everyone about the evaluation survey we're asking you to complete. This survey will open a different screen after the webinar. Your input is important because it'll help us improve our future webcast. And now let's get to some questions, and there have been quite a few, so thank you all very much for that. We had a couple of questions come in about training records or training files as it pertains to powered industrial trucks. So if a worker comes from a staffing agency, should they show up with their training records, or is it required that the staffing agency share those training files with the host employer?
Yes, it is. Especially, as I mentioned, the host employer should have a way to get a hard copy of that either online or printed it out. So that's because if a compliance officer comes on site for an inspection, they're going to ask for, the temp training files as well as your own company's employees. So you need a way to provide that, either, have it electronically sent to you or a hard copy so you can give that to the inspector. So yes, I would, if I'm getting employees, I would want their training records.
Tricia, is it required to have the physical copy of safety data sheets at all facilities if a software system is used to manage the inventory, such as SDS BinderWorks?
It is not required that you have binders of paper SDSs. Take a look at the regulation, the HazCom regulation 1910-1200, paragraph G, number 8. It explains how you are to maintain those safety data sheets and keep them available. And it does say that electronic access or other alternatives for maintaining copies of your safety data sheets is permitted, but there's one catch. As long as there are no barriers to immediate employee access in the workplace that are created by that. So by electronic access, your employees need a ready access. They need to know how to get in that system. They need to be able to get in that system by themselves. They shouldn't have to ask for permission or approval. It should be readily available in their work area. So just a little catch there. All right, good question.
I think we have time for one more. Tricia, is there any annual minimum number of hours for the continuing training program requirements for HazCom?
Okay, so for HazCom, as you recall, there were no annual requirements, no frequency. There was only retraining when a new hazard arrives at the workplace, and so you need to train on that. And OSHA does not. It's pretty flexible, does not specify the number of hours, not even for initial training, let alone a retraining there. So no hours. It's possible. It just needs to be effective. So whatever it takes to be effective, that's the amount of time or duration you want to look for. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. I'm sorry that we didn't get to everyone's questions, but unanswered questions will be forwarded to today's sponsor. Again, we also hope you take the time to share your feedback through our survey. This ends today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. I'd like to thank Tricia Hodkovich, Mark Stromey, our sponsor, J.J. Keller, and of course, everyone who joined us today. Take care and be safe.